The war was over. Across Europe, the guns had finally fallen silent. Cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and millions were trying to understand what peace even meant anymore. But in the cold gray waters of northern Scotland, something extraordinary was about to happen, an event so dramatic that even today it feels almost unbelievable. On June 21, 1919, beneath low-hanging clouds in a restless North Sea, the ocean itself would become a weapon. At anchor in the remote natural harbor of Scapa Flow sat one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled, the defeated high seas fleet of Imperial Germany. 74 warships, 11 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 8 cruisers, 50 destroyers. Silent, motionless, prisoners of war. For 7 months, these ships had waited under British guard, their guns disabled, ammunition removed, flags lowered. Once the pride of Kaiser Wilhelm's empire, they were now trophies, destined to be divided among the victorious Allies. But the German sailors who remained aboard them had no intention of letting that happen. Standing at the center of this floating graveyard was Rear Admiral Ludwig von Heuter, a career officer of the old Imperial Navy. He knew something the British did not. Negotiations in Versailles were collapsing. Germany faced humiliation, disarmament, and the permanent loss of its fleet. To von Heuter, surrender was acceptable. Dishonor was not. And so, quietly, patiently, he waited. A fleet in limbo. Scapa Flow was chosen because it was isolated, heavily defended, and impossible to escape. The British believed the German ships were harmless, giant steel husks waiting for paperwork to decide their fate. They were wrong. Below decks, German crews, reduced but loyal, continued routine maintenance. Pumps were inspected, valves were memorized, seacocks were quietly loosened. Nothing obvious, nothing suspicious. The British guards rotated, patrol boats circled lazily. On June 21st, many of them left the harbor entirely, sailing out for naval exercises, assuming the fleet posed no threat. That assumption would cost them history. At 10 a.m., von Reuter gave the signal, a simple order passed from ship to ship. Paragraph 11. Confirm. Across the fleet, officers nodded, wrenches turned, valves opened, water rushed in. The greatest self-destruction in naval history. One by one, the ships began to die. At first, slowly, an unnatural list, a deck tilting where it shouldn't. Then, faster, portholes slipped below the waves, funnels touched the sea. Crews abandoned ship, sliding down ropes, leaping into oil-stained water. British sailors returned in shock, firing rifles, trying to force Germans back aboard to save the ships. Too late. Battleships rolled over like dying whales. Destroyers vanished in minutes. The sea filled with smoke, steam, and steel. By nightfall, 52 German warships lay on the bottom of Scapa Flow. The Kaiser's navy was gone by its own hand. Why this story matters. What happened at Scapa Flow was not an act of rage. It was calculated, deliberate, strategic. It denied the Allies the spoils of victory. It erased decades of naval competition in a single day, and it reshaped how nations thought about honor, defeat, and control of the seas. But this was only the beginning, because the sunken fleet did not stay forgotten. In the decades that followed, divers would descend into the wrecks, salvage kings would risk everything to raise battleships from the seabed,
and radioactive steel from these ships would become some of the most valuable material on Earth. In Part 2, we will dive into the frantic British response, the trials and punishments that followed, and the unbelievable salvage operations that resurrected giants from the ocean floor. This is not just a story about ships. It is a story about pride, defiance, and the moment an empire chose the sea over surrender.
Race against the sea. When the last German battleship slipped beneath the gray waters of Scapa Flow, the harbor fell unnaturally quiet. The sea was calm again, but what lay beneath it was unprecedented. 52 warships, some of them among the most powerful ever built, now rested upside down on the seabed. The British Royal Navy stood stunned. This was not merely a loss of material, it was an act of defiance that denied the victors their prize and embarrassed the world's most powerful navy in its own waters. Admiral Sir Sidney Fremantle, commander of the British fleet at Scapa Flow, was furious. Courts-martial followed. German officers were interrogated, but the truth was unavoidable. The High Seas Fleet had obeyed its final order perfectly. And now Britain faced a new problem. A steel graveyard with no answers. Scapa Flow had become a floating obstacle course of wrecks. Some ships rested upright in shallow water, others lay upside down, their hulls looming just beneath the surface, dangerous to navigation. Leaving them there was not an option. These were not just warships, they were strategic assets, millions of tons of high-grade steel, engines, turbines, and armored plate. In the interwar years, steel was money, steel was power. The British government wanted the wrecks removed. The problem was simple. No one had ever raised battleships this large before. Enter the Salvage King. In the early 20th century, an unlikely figure stepped forward. Ernest Cox. He was not an admiral, not an engineer by training, not even a diver. He was a scrap metal merchant. Cox believed something others thought impossible, that modern engineering, patience, and sheer stubbornness could lift entire capital ships from the seabed. Where the Admiralty saw sunken monsters, Cox saw profit. He purchased salvage rights for a fraction of their true value. What followed became one of the greatest engineering challenges in maritime history. Lifting giants from the deep. The destroyers came first. Cox's crews sealed hull breaches, pumped air into compartments, and watched in disbelief as steel ships that had been dead for years slowly broke the surface. Success bred confidence. Then came the cruisers. Larger, heavier, far more complex. They fought him every step of the way, twisting cables, collapsing bulkheads, unpredictable buoyancy. Each lift was a gamble. One miscalculation could send a ship crashing back to the seabed, killing divers and destroying months of work. And then came the battleships. Ships like SMS Hindenburg, Kaiser, and Derfflinger, monsters weighing over 26,000 tons. To raise them, Cox's team worked in near total darkness, dove into flooded compartments filled with silt and debris, risked decompression sickness daily, invented new techniques as problems emerged. This was salvage by trial and error, paid for in blood, time, and steel. The sea fights back. The ocean did not surrender easily. Storms ripped ships free from lifting cables. Sudden shifts in weight crushed internal supports. One cruiser capsized mid-raise, killing workers and sinking again like a wounded animal. Years passed. Millions of pounds were spent. But one by one, the wrecks came up. By the mid-1930s, 45 of the original 52 scuttled ships had been raised or dismantled. The impossible had been done. Yet, 7 ships remained. They were left behind deliberately. The ships that could not be touched. The deepest wrecks, massive battleships resting far below safe salvage depth, were abandoned. Technology simply wasn't ready, and so they stayed. As decades passed, something unexpected happened. These ships became valuable again, but for a reason no one in 1919 could have imagined. Steel from before the atomic age. After 1945, the world changed. Nuclear weapons reshaped science, warfare, and industry, but they also contaminated the environment, introducing background radiation into steel production worldwide. For certain scientific instruments, Geiger counters, space sensors, medical imaging, modern steel was unusable. Only steel made before nuclear testing was pure enough. And there, resting quietly in Scapa Flow, lay thousands of tons of it. Low background steel. The sunken German warships became one of the most valuable submerged resources on Earth. Divers returned, not to raise the ships, but to carefully remove sections, one plate at a time, for laboratories and hospitals around the world. A legacy beneath the waves. Today, Scapa Flow is silent again. The remaining wrecks are protected war graves. Divers swim through twisted corridors where sailors once stood at attention. Guns still point outward. Nameplates still bear the Kaiser's crest. They are monuments, not to victory, but to choice. In Part 3, we will explore the men who went down with the fleet, the British sailors who tried to stop the scuttling, and how this single act of defiance influenced naval treaties and disarmament worldwide. Because Scapa Flow wasn't just the end of a fleet, it was the moment naval warfare realized that control of the seas does not always belong to the winner. Honor, ashes, and the shadow of the future. Long after the bubbles stopped rising at Scapa Flow, the war refused to end. For the men who had opened the valves and abandoned their ships, survival did not mean freedom. It meant interrogation, accusation, and a reckoning with a world that no longer needed their loyalty, but still feared its meaning. The British called it sabotage. The Germans called it duty. History would call it something else entirely. The men who obeyed. When the High Seas Fleet sank itself, nearly 1,800 German sailors were still aboard. Most escaped into the freezing water. Some did not. 9 men died that day. They were not killed by shells or torpedoes, but by rifle fire from British guards who believed, too late, that the Germans were trying to seize their ships. The deaths were awkward, uncomfortable. They did not fit the narrative of victory. Their names were quietly recorded, their bodies buried far from home. The British Admiralty wanted the incident forgotten as quickly as possible, but the German sailors remembered. To them, Scapa Flow was not a defeat. It was the final battle of the Imperial Navy, and the only one they believed they had truly won. Von Reuter on trial. Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter was arrested within hours. British officers demanded to know who had given the order. Von Reuter did not deny it. He did not apologize. He explained calmly that his instructions were clear. If the fleet was to be seized, it would be destroyed. The legal situation was murky. Technically, Germany and Britain were still in a state of armistice, not peace. The ships were interned, not surrendered. After weeks of debate, von Reuter was released. No court wanted to establish a precedent that surrender meant ownership. In Germany, he returned home quietly, but to many former sailors, he was a hero. The message he sent. The scuttling sent shockwaves far beyond Scotland. Naval planners around the world took notice. The event proved something dangerous. A defeated fleet could still deny victory. Material superiority meant nothing without control, and morale, when aligned with ideology, could outweigh strategy.
These lessons fed directly into the naval treaties of the 1920s. The treaties born from the sea. Just 3 years later, world powers gathered in Washington. The result was the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, a radical attempt to prevent another arms race like the one that had led to the First World War. Battleships were limited, fleets were capped, construction was frozen. Scapa Flow hovered over every negotiation. Delegates feared not just war, but waste. The idea that entire fleets could be built at enormous cost, only to be destroyed by their own crews, horrified treasuries and politicians alike. For a moment, it seemed the world had learned.
A ghost that would not stay buried. But treaties are only as strong as the will to honor them. In the 1930s, Germany rearmed. New ships rose under new names. Old lessons were remembered, but twisted. This time, there would be no surrender, no internment, no scuttling. The Kriegsmarine would fight to the end. And in 1945, when Germany faced defeat again, the sea would claim its ships once more, at Kiel, at Wilhelmshaven, at the bottom of the Baltic. Scapa Flow had become a blueprint. The wrecks as war graves. Today, the remaining ships are protected. Divers descend slowly, respectfully. These are not tourist attractions, they are underwater tombs. Inside, boots still rest beneath bunks. Gauges are frozen in time. Doors remain shut, because opening them would disturb what should stay sealed. German and British descendants now visit together. No flags, no salutes, only silence. What Scapa Flow really means. This story is not about Germany. It is not about Britain. It is about choice. The decision to deny an enemy victory even when defeat is inevitable. The belief that honor can survive loss. And the uncomfortable truth that history is shaped as much by defiance as by triumph. The High Seas Fleet never fired another shot. Yet its final act echoed through a century of naval strategy, diplomacy, and memory. Because sometimes the most powerful statement a fleet can make is to disappear